He let out a kind of a war cry. It was not quite a war cry, it was more like a sobbing sort of cry. As you recall, he described himself as being in utter anguish. His heart was burdened and broken for his kinsmen. As we come to the beginning of chapter 10, he kind of picks up on that same feeling, although he describes it in very different terms. Listen to chapter 10, he opens up with brothers. So he starts with this phrase of congeniality, this closeness, this intimacy. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them, and them is Israel, his kinsmen, is that they may be saved. So in chapter 9, when he opened up the chapter, his heart was broken, and he went on to explain that the reason his heart was broken was because his kinsmen, his people, his nation, God's chosen people, his brothers, his sisters, his family were not saved. And the rest of chapter 9 was talking about how can that possibly be? How can God's chosen people not be chosen? How can the chosen people of God not be saved? And he went on to defend that position from 3 or 4 different perspectives and to describe how exactly it is that God's chosen people were not saved. And in fact, how that actually proved and supported the gospel in a sort of topsy-turvy way. But you can imagine how hard it would be to hear something like that as a Jew. To hear somebody come to you and say, you aren't saved. You as a people collectively are not believers. You as a people have rejected God's plan of redemption. Jesus is God's Messiah, and you missed it. And you're missing it still today. You can imagine how hard it would be to receive a message like that. And Paul knows it. So he opens up by being very vulnerable and sharing his heart with his readers, saying, my heart is breaking over this. And he sandwiches it in between this and the beginning of chapter 10, where he describes again his heart's desire. It's a deep desire. It's a passion. It's what he longs for most in the world. My heart's desire, and he says, I pray for this. My heart's desire and my prayer is that they would be saved. My kinsmen would be saved. So he opens by saying they're not saved, and it breaks my heart. And then he sandwiches it in with a commitment to prayer and an affirmation that this is the focus of his heart's, the keenest part of his heart's desire is that the people would be saved. He has something that's hard to say, hard to hear, but he needs to say it. And so in order to say it, he sandwiches it in between 2 slices of love. It's as if he's following his own advice from Ephesians 4:15, where he tells the Ephesians to speak the truth in love. And there's lots of times that people get this wrong. Christians get it wrong, non-Christians get it wrong. People in general, a lot of times, really flub this up. They will either speak the truth, or they will speak in what they consider to be a loving way, but they won't speak the truth in love. They'll speak the truth in a way that's hurtful. And a lot of people will actually take pride in this. They'll say, I just say it how it is. I call a spade a spade. And if they can't handle it, well, they need to suck it up, and they need to put on some big boy pants. They need to grow up, and they need to deal with it. Does that sound loving to you? It sounds like they're willing to speak the truth. They're willing to speak their mind. They're willing to speak out. But it doesn't sound like there's very much love involved. And sometimes when that's being spoken, it's not even truth that's being spoken. It's just a matter of personal opinion. And we as Christians have to be very careful to distinguish between the two. Because sometimes I think we can say our opinion as if it is eternal truth. And we have to be very cautious and very thoughtful. Because when we speak our opinion as if it's eternal truth, it compromises what actually is eternal truth. Because the listener, the person that we're speaking to, if they hear us and we're saying something that isn't eternally true, that isn't God's word, that isn't biblical truth, and they hear that and they say, but wait a second, that's not actually true, that's wrong. Then that leaves the door open to say, if that's wrong and they consider that to be truth, What else in the Bible is wrong? That may not be in the Bible, but as a Christian, we stand for Christ. We are representatives of Christ. We are ambassadors for Christ. And if we say something is true, it needs to be true. If we declare something to be truth, it needs to be truth. And sometimes it's just our own opinion. Sometimes it's our own feeling. Sometimes it's our own perspective. We've got to be very thoughtful when we do that. But the other side of that same coin is to speak the truth in love. And the people that err on this side, a lot of times will consider that they're saying something loving, or they believe that they're saying something loving. And so in fact, they may see somebody doing something wrong or speaking something that is untrue, and they'll say the loving thing to do is to keep quiet. I won't speak. Or the loving thing to do would just be to affirm them as people, to pat them on the back, and to just love them through their mistakes and their errors, and just to not say anything. And that's wrong too, because that lets people go on in their ignorance, go on in their mistakes, go on in this flawed way, believing what is false, or living in a way that is dishonoring to Christ, that is hurtful to themselves, or maybe their children, or maybe to the message and the mission of Christ. So this balance always has to be maintained between speaking the truth, but speaking it in love, being loving. Speaking the truth and being loving must always be married together. And I believe that's what Paul is really doing here when he begins chapter 9 and begins chapter 10 in these same ways, is he's speaking the truth. He says, my kinsmen are not believers. They've missed the gospel. But it breaks my heart, and I love them so much, and I'm praying for them, and I'm in utter anguish constantly. And he's just describing his passion for his people, and he's sharing that love. Have you ever had to tell your spouse something they didn't want to hear? Tell them a truth that they didn't really want to hear? Have you ever had to do that? If you're thoughtful about it, I would hope that you took some time to do it with some sensitivity. You know, when Tara has to tell me something that I don't want to hear, she takes time and does it thoughtfully. She chooses the right time. Right? Timing's a big deal. You know, if I walk home from church and I walk in and she's like, "Oh man, that sermon stank." You know what I feel like doing? Turning around and walking back out, going to somebody else in the church and saying, "Was it really that bad?" Because I know probably 9 times out of 10, people outside of my house are going to maybe flub a little bit and say, "You know what, it wasn't that bad." And boy, I'm going to feel a lot better. But she's very thoughtful about when and how to communicate this. Maybe in your house, to communicate a hard truth, you need to buy a gift first, or flowers. Or maybe you need to go out to dinner. Or maybe you need to, again, encircle it around, wreath it around with positive comments. "Honey, I love you so much. I respect you more than anybody else I know. You mean so much, and our relationship is so important." But you're all waiting for it, right? You know it's coming, right? You spoke the truth, but you surrounded it with something that was going to help the truth be accepted. Because that's why you do it. You love the people, and you want to communicate the idea in a way that's going to be received. Because communication has multiple parts to it. One of the things is to get it out of your mouth. And that's what the people that speak truth and don't care what the people feel about it, they feel that first part is really important. I've got to say what I need to say. I need to be heard. But they really don't care that the person hearing it's going to receive it in the way that they want it to be received, or that it's going to communicate the thing that they want to communicate. Because you may speak the truth over here, and the message that they're hearing is that guy is awful. That girl is horrible. I don't like that person. And that's the message that they receive. Message received. Wrong message. But Paul is very thoughtful. He says, I know this is going to be hard. This is a hard truth. And so to do it, he surrounds it with this envelope of love. At the beginning of chapter 10, my heart's desire. Brothers, my heart's desire, my deepest passion, my deepest yearning, the thing that I want more than anything else, the thing that I pray about, the thing that I pray about day and night, the thing that I want the Lord to hear and do for me, is that they say that they, my people, my brothers and sisters, my fellow Jews, my family, may be saved. He's just finished talking the entire chapter 9 about how they weren't saved. But he puts the period on the end of that sentence by saying, this is my heart's desire, and this is my prayer for them. Chapter 10 is actually going to continue a discussion on how Israel is not saved, and how Paul is going to continue to describe why it is that they're not saved. And he picks this up here right after that opening verse by saying it in verse 2. In fact, some people say chapter 10 and chapter 9 should be connected. There shouldn't be a chapter marker. You all know that chapter markers weren't in the original version. You know that when Paul wrote it, he wasn't writing and he gets to a stop and he said, oh, here's chapter 9 of my letter. How many of you write letters with chapters in them? You don't. Paul didn't either. How many of you write letters with verses? Paul didn't either. And so some people say that chapter 9 and chapter 10 should be tied together. I think that that's true because the ideas are so tied together. In fact, 9, 10, and 11 are really tied together. But I think that maybe the medieval monk that decided where the chapter breaks should be, when he got to this point, he was looking at chapter 9 and it says, here, Paul's heart is breaking for his people. He wants them to be saved. His heart's in utter anguish. In chapter 10, it's kind of the same thing. I think maybe that's why he said, oh, this is a new chapter, because he's starting again. He's starting with the same idea, and so he starts a new chapter here. But he's going to continue to explain why it is and how it is that God's chosen people are not believers. Verse 2 is where he does this, where he begins this. He says, I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness that comes from God, and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. So the problem here in verses 2 and 3 is Israel's ignorance. Paul says they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. They have a passion, a zeal. And this zeal that the Jews had was expressed in extreme ways. The Jews dedicated their lives to knowing God's Word. They dedicated themselves to studying God's Word. And so they had this passion, this zeal that Paul is describing, and Paul knew it firsthand. Do you remember how passionate Paul was about the law? How passionate, how zealous he was? He describes his own zeal by referring to the Stephen incident in Acts chapter 6 and 7. 7 and 8, I think. He says he was standing there when Stephen was killed, and he was approving the death of Stephen. And Paul went on to find other Christians and try to imprison them. He had such passion that he was willing to kill somebody to protect the law. That's zeal. It's undeniable. If you are willing to kill somebody for something, you have a passion for it. You have a zeal for it. If you're willing to take a life for it, there is no two ways about it. And I don't care what the thing is that you're killing for, you have a passion for that thing. Drug addicts have a passion for their drug addiction. It's a wrong passion. It's a wrong zeal, but it's a passion. And Paul had a wrong passion, and that was for the law, but he was killing Christians for it. And he says the Jews have this same zeal, this misplaced zeal for God. They worked their entire lives to understand the law and to live the law out. They worked really hard to know the details of every letter of the law of the Old Testament. They studied it night and day. They understood it. They wrote commentaries on it. Think about it. They wore clothes as the law prescribed. They shaved their beards as they believed God wanted them to. Their diet consisted only of food that they thought God approved of. Every aspect of their lives, their marriages were based on what they felt God wanted them to do. Every part of their life was dedicated and committed to fulfilling and living out the law of God. That's zeal. That's passion. The problem is it's misplaced zeal. It's misplaced passion. Not in the law itself, but in the reason behind it. As I shared with the kids, the Jews thought that as they were following the law, that, let me give you another analogy, another illustration here. They got the question right. They got the answer wrong. You all remember back in math class in elementary school? I know you're going to like this one. Back in math class, they would give you a question. And the question would always have a bunch of words in it with a couple of numbers scattered around. And the first thing you had to do was figure out, what's the question? What's the question that I need to be answering? And then you would write it out, what the equation actually was, and then you would find the answer. So, for instance, Johnny went to the store to get apples. He got 2 York apples, like that, York apples, and he got 2 Granny Smith apples. How many apples did Johnny get altogether? So obviously the question that you have to figure out is, what do I do here? What numbers do I have? Well, I have 2 and 2, and what do I do with those numbers? Do I add, subtract, multiply, divide, or some other weird and funky math formulation should I do with them? Well, in elementary school, it's 2 apples of York and 2 apples of Granny Smith. Total of 2 plus 2. I add 2 plus 2. They got the right question. They figured out the question. The problem was they got 7. Johnny came home with 7 apples. That doesn't make any sense. They figured out, the Jews figured out, what is the question? The question is righteousness. They realized that people are sinful. They realized that God is holy. They realized that for sinful people to enter into God's holy presence, something needed to change about them. They realized that heaven was perfect, a place of perfect bliss, perfect integrity, perfect honoring of God, perfect worship. And they said, well, we are imperfect people, and something has to change for us to go into that perfect place. And they said, well, God gave us the law. So this has got to be our big clue. They got the right question. How do we get righteousness? We need righteousness to go to heaven. They got the right numbers. The law has something to do with it, but they got the wrong answer. Their final answer was, so we need to obey the law and live perfectly righteous lives so that we can go to heaven. Because by living perfectly righteous lives, we then become perfect. Or if we live perfectly righteous lives, then we are perfect. And so they strived. They struggled. They tried their best to live the law out in their lives daily so that they could earn the right to enter into that perfect place of eternal bliss with that Holy Father in that perfect home called heaven. They got the right equation. Sinful man needs a change to righteousness, a conversion to righteousness, equals, and their answer was obeying the law. And that was the wrong answer. They missed it. They missed it. And that's what Paul's saying. It's ignorance. They got the right question. They were ignorant of the right answer. The right question, the wrong answer. And this is what the Jews were working with. And this is what Paul is going to spend the rest of chapter 10 talking about. What were the Jews ignorant about? And he's going to give us 5 things. And we're going to look at those things over the next several weeks about how the Jews were ignorant and how they came to the wrong conclusion. And what were those conclusions that they came to? He says, for being ignorant, verse 3, of the righteousness that comes from God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. So the law, and actually, why don't I go ahead and read the last verse here. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So the law, the purpose of the law that the Jews missed, they thought it was a guideline for how to become, how to be, how to act righteous. Maybe that's the best way of saying it. When in fact, it was really a guideline on how to receive perfect righteousness. See, the law in the Old Testament was always designed to do a couple of things, but none of those things was ever to help a person become and act righteously, perfectly, and earn your way to heaven. The law does a couple of things. First of all, it points out that we can't live righteously, that we can't live perfectly, because if you read through the Old Testament, you know that you've already messed up, and one mess up is enough. That's it. One sin. That's it. One sin is enough to condemn us. eternally. We're gone. Period. Anybody here who hasn't sinned, raise your hand. Okay? And if you are thinking, I'm raising my hand in my head, I just don't want to raise it out because there are people around me. Then you go, two things are going on there. One, you're lying because I just asked the question. I said, raise your hand. If you didn't raise your hand, so there's your first sin. Secondly, there's a sin of pride going on, right? Because you think I'm perfect and you missed it, so you're lying to yourself, you're lying to the people around you, and you're arrogant because you think you're perfect. But see, there's no, even just one question in church can mess you up. We've all sinned. And that's what the Bible says. That's what Romans 3, that's what Paul spent 3 chapters making sure to make it very clear. We've all sinned. And so we can't live that righteous life. And the law was designed to help us see that. Not so that we could just end up wallowing in self-pity. Oh, it's me, I can't live the law righteously. But to help us and to point us to the way by which we can accomplish or receive righteousness. Not accomplish it because it's already been accomplished for us. To receive that righteousness. And so that's what Paul says here in 3 and 4. Being ignorant of the righteousness that comes from God. Righteousness that comes out of heaven from God for us. He came out of heaven as a person, in fact. And then verse 4 says, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness. So Christ ended the law in a couple of different ways. Christ brought the end of the law in a couple of different ways. First of all, the law was designed to point to him. So something that is designed to point to somebody is only useful until you get the thing that you're pointed at. So a map, or a GPS, right, in these modern days. Do you remember what maps are? Everybody here remember what a map? So use your imagination. If you don't know what a map is, GPSs work pretty well. But the whole point of a map or a GPS is to help you find your destination. And so long as you're looking, the map and the destination and the GPS are important. But once you reach your destination, you can fold up the map. You don't need the map anymore because you're there. The GPS says, what? You have reached your destination. And then it stops talking. The law was designed to point to Christ. So when Christ finally came, the law was fulfilled. There was an end to the law in that way. But also, Christ is an end to the law because the law says this is what you need to do to live a perfectly righteous life. And Christ was the only one that was able to do that, and he did it. So in a sense, he fulfilled it by living it. And so he was an end to the law in that way. Another way that he was an end to the law was that the law was designed to help Israel stand out as a people. They were to be separate, different from everybody else. Why? Because they had this law that they followed. They were supposed to help everybody see we are God's chosen people. Not so that they could say, look how good we are God's chosen people. But so that the other people who weren't God's chosen people could say, well, how is it that you're God's chosen people? And what does it mean to be God's chosen person? And what does God teach? And what does God want from us? And you're God's chosen people, so teach me. Tell us. And they said, no, we are God's chosen people. Stay away from us. Keep out. Stay back. They missed it. The whole point of them being God's chosen people was to help other people come to know who God was. And they missed it. And so that distinctness that the law created in the people of Israel is no longer needed. Why? Because Israel, in a sense, is no longer God's chosen people. They're not the ones that people need to go to find God's grace and God's mercy and God's forgiveness. In fact, Israel isn't Israel. Isn't that what Paul just said a few verses ago? All Israel is not Israel. Who is Israel? The true Israel is made up of believers, Jews and non-Jews put together. And so the law has come to an end for its distinctive purposes, saying that we are different people, Israel. Now we are different people, believers. We are different people, Christians. Christians of all nations, of all nationalities, of all backgrounds, of all ethnicities are God's people. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. That's that key. And Paul's bringing us back to it. Paul has actually spent quite a bit of time early on in Romans talking about this, about chapters 4 and 5, about righteousness comes by faith. Or righteousness comes by believing in Jesus. By believing what the Bible says about him, by living your belief out in your life. And so this is how this passage ends, that the righteousness is for everyone who believes. The Jews had a misplaced zeal, a misguided zeal. And that was a dangerous thing back then, but it's a dangerous thing today as well. Because misplaced zeal can do all sorts of terrible things. You remember the Crusades? Misplaced zeal. Political people in power took the the people that were zealous for their religion, and they used that zeal and said, we need to get back to Holy Lands. And they used that to conquer Israel and parts of the Middle East. But you know it wasn't true religious zeal, because when they got there, how much evangelism went on? Instead, barbary, butcher went on. And the opportunity was missed to give those people 1,000 years ago the hope of the gospel. To share with them, this is the love of Christ. Now that we're here, this is what Jesus is teaching. This is what eternal life is. They missed it. It wasn't true religious zeal. It was perverted religious zeal. It was misplaced religious zeal. Today, we can also see some misplaced religious zeal in Christian cults. You know, people move on to communes. They give up all their possessions. And they follow a charismatic leader to do all sorts of crazy things. Some of which end up in hurting people or even death. And my hope is that those sorts of things won't be the things that you fall for. I hope that those aren't the things you're struggling with, cults and crusades like that. But you might be. Or maybe you were. Or maybe you have family that are involved in something like that. I think probably the biggest struggle that we as Christians face is what ends up being legalism, where misplaced zeal, where we're zealous for the letter of the law, like the Jews were, but not zealous for the spirit of the law. Where we make these rules and these guidelines, and they actually, in a sense, exceed the Bible. Where legalism takes over, and where your personal view on what it means to be a Christian is imposed on somebody else. So we can think of different situations. Dress codes. Great example. You say, you must wear a certain color to be a Christian. Or you must wear a certain level of formality. You know, if we were to say suddenly here, I know we're going to step on some toes here, you have to wear a tie, gentlemen, to come to church, or else you're not a good Christian. I know that you've heard this before, and I know that you probably know maybe a church that's not very far from here that espouses this sort of teaching. What's the problem with that? Is it wrong to wear a tie to church? No, it's not wrong. If you wear a tie to church because you think that the tie honors God, you are doing absolutely the right thing. But you cannot say then, since me wearing a tie honors God, you wearing a tie is going to honor God, and you not wearing a tie dishonors God, so get your tie on. It doesn't work like that. That becomes legalism. That's a problem. Or a specific translation of the Bible. If I like a specific translation, that's great. And if I think that that's the translation that helps me understand God best and worship God most, if it's a good, faithful translation, great. But who says English is the best language to read the Bible in? Who was the one that said English was the best? Well, God didn't. If God thought English was the best, he would have chose English to write it in. Instead, he chose Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. So if you're going to argue that one translation is best, I suggest we go to the Greek and the Aramaic. It's okay. It's great if you say, this is the translation that speaks to me. That's perfect. This is the way that I honor God. That's great. That's wonderful. Honor God in that way. But when I say you have to read my translation, we're running into problems. That's when we get into legalism and misplaced zeal. There's all sorts of things. We talk about the color of the carpet. We can talk about what we do here at church Wednesday nights or Thursday nights, or how the building is going to be used. We say, this is absolutely wrong because I don't like it. Misplaced zeal. You know, when people come to church, people are here, a misplaced zeal will be like, you're here, but you're not in the right attitude because I don't like the way your attitude is. You don't do it how I think you should do it, so that's wrong. That's misplaced zeal. And that's what the Jews are being chastised here by Paul. He said they missed it. They focused on the letter of the law, on obeying the letter of the law, and they forgot why the law came, to point to Christ. And the reason to obey the law is because, like the children told us, because we love Jesus. We want to obey not because it's going to earn us righteousness. We want to obey because Jesus wants us to obey, and we love Jesus. That's the reason to obey the law. That's right-placed zeal. Because you can't say all zeal is wrong. Jesus was described as having zeal for the Father's house, wasn't he? When he flipped over the tables, remember? It said, and he was quoting from Psalms, it will be said of him, zeal for the Lord's house consumes him. Jesus had zeal. Zeal is good if it is properly placed. We need to make sure that our zeal is in the right thing. We need to have zeal for the truth. We need to have zeal for the truth, which is found in this book. We need to have zeal for living out that truth and living out our faith. Not because it's going to earn us heaven, but because we love the God who's in heaven, who sent his Son for us. We need to have zeal for the gospel. And we need to have zeal for souls that are lost, that don't know any of this. We need to have zeal for these sorts of things. Right place zeal is absolutely appropriate and perfect. Misguided zeal is going to get us into all sorts of trouble. Any church into all sorts of trouble. So, you'll notice that our closing hymn is 422, A Passion for Souls. And so that's my prayer for us, that we will get our zeal in the right place, facing the right direction. Because misplaced zeal, it's kind of like getting in your car, going the wrong direction, and saying, the best way for me to fix this is to step on the gas. Doesn't make sense. You got to get yourself oriented right before you begin moving. Right zeal is going to go a long way to helping us honor the Lord we love. As a church and as individuals. And that's my prayer for us today. Let's pray. Lord, you have zeal. You have zeal. You have